Talmud tells us that Rabbi Yochanan was not only a great, wise sage, but was also one of the most beautiful people in the world. His beauty was so remarkable that people would stop and stare at him. Shimon ben Lakish was an outlaw. One day, Reish Lakish, as he was often called, was swimming in the Jordan River when he saw what he thought was a beautiful woman from afar. Wanting to impress her, he performed an incredible feat and jumped across the river. It was only then that he realized that the beautiful woman was a he. Not batting an eyelash, Rabbi Yochanan convinced him on the spot to use his strength for Torah. To sweeten the deal, he told him that if he was successful, he would talk to his sister, who was even more beautiful than he, to marry him. Reish Lakish agreed. Indeed, he put his heart and soul into learning and eventually became the great Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, the primary learning partner of Rabbi Yochanan. One day, the sages were engaging in a dispute concerning the ritual impurity of swords, knives, and other implements. Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish vehemently disagreed with one another, and the argument got so heated that Rabbi Yochanan insulted Lakish, saying basically, "It figures you would know about weapons since you're a criminal yourself." Lakish shot back, calling into question Yochanan's motives for teaching him Torah in the first place. Rabbi Yochanan was offended, which in turn affected Reish Lakish, who fell ill. Rabbi Yochanan's sister, who was, remember, Reish Lakish's wife, came crying to her brother Yochanan, begging that he pray for her husband's recovery. "Do this for the sake of my children," she begged, "so that they should have a father." But he would not. "Do so for the sake of my widowed head." But he would not. Ultimately, Reish Lakish died. Rabbi Yochanan was devastated over losing him. The rabbis said, "Who will go to calm Rabbi Yochanan's mind and comfort him over his loss?" They decided to send Rabbi Elazar ben Padat, since he was academically gifted and clever and would be able to serve as a worthy substitute for Reish Lakish. And so, Rabbi Elazar ben Padat went to learn with Rabbi Yochanan. But for everything Rabbi Yochanan would say, Elazar would find a proof text to support his opinion. He agreed with everything Yochanan said. "How are you like Reish Lakish?" Yochanan complained. "In my discussions with him, when I would state a matter, he would raise 24 difficulties against me in an attempt to disprove my claim. And I would answer him with 24 answers, and the halakha, the Jewish law by itself, would become broadened and clarified. And yet you just say yes and agree with everything I say. Do I not know that already that what I say is good?" Being rebutted by Reish Lakish served a purpose. Your bringing proof to my statements does not. Rabbi Yochanan was so distressed, he walked around tearing his clothing, weeping and saying, "Where are you, son of Lakish? Where are you, son of Lakish?" Rabbi Yochanan screamed until he went insane. The rabbis prayed and requested for God to have mercy on him and take his soul, and Rabbi Yochanan died. Rabbi Yochanan needed his friend, his partner, his counterpart, Reish Lakish. Arguing with one another sharpened their own positions and ultimately helped shape Jewish practice. Without someone to challenge him, Yochanan had nothing to live for. We have a concept in Judaism of machloket l'shem shamayim, a disagreement for the sake of heaven. That is to say, a disagreement that serves a noble or even divine purpose. The great sages Hillel and Shammai are held up as paradigms of this ideal. They disagreed with each other on virtually everything, but their disagreements served not to demonize or cancel the other. On the contrary, Hillel would quote Shammai's opinions before sharing his own, and all of their opinions are preserved in our sacred writings. They used their disagreement to bring them closer to understanding the truth, to hone their opinions and understandings of Torah and law in order to land at the most truthful position possible. They were able to hold opposing views while still respecting one another, without selfishness or lust for power. They approached their disagreements with humility, curiosity, and a willingness to listen. Our tradition treasures good faith arguments and disagreements. In fact, two Torah scholars who hone each other's intellect through halachic discourse and argument are considered the intellectual and moral equivalent of three people. Three people are needed to say Birkat Hamazon, the grace after meals, aloud together. But if only two people say the prayer, and they happen to be adversarial scholars, then they are considered as the requisite three. This blows my mind. I'm glad it affected you too. The Talmud isn't advocating for counting a child who is almost 13 or a Torah scroll. It actually says that because of the argument, there's the equivalent of an extra person in the room. The argument literally takes on a life of its own. This is important because the argument, as it were, exists outside of the two scholars. It's not held on to like a grudge or internalized or personalized. It doesn't define who each individual is. The argument sits over there. And these two occupy their own space. And what also blows my mind here is that these two adversaries are having a meal together. They discuss and argue and disagree, probably raising voices and waving hands and beating the table while doing so. And then at the end of it, no matter who prevails, they sit down and break bread together and chant the grace after meals together. Unbelievable. And yet, this is the way it should be. If the argument is a third person at the table, then these two friends can acknowledge it or ignore it or choose to talk about something else and enjoy their meal. People ought to be able to disagree vehemently, even, with one another, and still maintain mutual respect. That is the ideal which I think used to be the norm, but has lately, sadly, dropped out of fashion. Because we no longer know how to argue properly. Instead of arguing l'shem shamayim for a noble or divine purpose, we argue like Yochanan and Lachish to the death. There's a folk prayer in our tradition based on a discussion the rabbis have in the Talmud. In it, the rabbis sing the praises of one who is insulted but who does not insult in turn. It says, and the sages taught, about those who are insulted and do not insult, who hear their shame and do not respond, who act out of love and are joyful in suffering, the verse says, and they that love God are as the sun going forth in its might. We need to relearn the skill of not insulting the other when disagreeing, of not trying to destroy the other's reputation just because we hold differing views. We need to be able to see the argument as separate from the person. We see vestiges of this ability still in our secular life. In Canada, as in Great Britain, we have the tradition of the loyal opposition. By definition, the loyal opposition indicates that the non-governing parties oppose the actions of the sitting cabinet while remaining loyal to the formal sources of the government's power. In other words, it's their job to argue with the government and to hold them to account. That's what makes the government better as a whole. As you know, there's a lot of yelling and shouting in the House of Commons. There's heated debate and perhaps even challenging people's motives. But at the base of it all, the ministers are colleagues who are all trying to improve the way our country runs. This is how secular judges work as well. In a statement that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg of blessed memory released to the public on the death of Justice Antonin Scalia in 2016, she said, "We disagreed now and then, but when I wrote for the court and received a Scalia dissent, the opinion ultimately released was notably better than my initial circulation. Justice Scalia nailed all the weak spots, the applesauce and the urgle-burgle, and gave me just what I needed to strengthen the majority opinion." They were even close friends who enjoyed going to the opera together. Our arguing and discussion, disagreeing and challenging force us to consider, hone, and sharpen our own positions. We need a challenger to push us to make us better. In the Bible's book of Proverbs, King Solomon, the attributed author of this wisdom literature, writes, all the ways of a person might seem right to them in their own eyes. So true, isn't it? We don't see our faults or errors, at least not initially, or while we're making them. King Solomon also said, if you see a person who thinks themselves wise, there is more hope for a fool than for such a person. None of us wants to be a fool. We all want to improve. That's why we're here, isn't it? That's what these 10 days of repentance are all about. We want to be better and do better. We need an adversary to challenge us and push us, to argue with us and even chastise us. And we need to be that person for others, but always and only l'shem shamayim, for the sake of heaven. And with the argument sitting over there, rather than overtaking the whole atmosphere and ruining relationships. Rabbi Yochanan fought with his friend so fiercely that he caused his friend's death and ultimately his own. He was unable to separate the argument from the arguer. His regret at having done so and the hole that was left in his life due to his biggest challenger's absence was too much to bear, and so he died. Rav and Shmuel were early rabbis who sometimes taught each other, sometimes depended on one another, and often disagreed. Nevertheless, it is related that when Rav died, Shmuel tore 13 garments as a sign of mourning rather than just the usual one, and said, "The man of whom I had so much use has departed." So, you know what? It's okay if we don't all agree on everything. We don't have to agree about Israel or taxes, the solution to homelessness, or LGBTQ plus issues. People are allowed to use words that might challenge us, like occupation or settlements or apartheid, without being branded an anti-Zionist or worse. We need to be able to ask questions about sexuality and gender without being called intolerant. We need to be able to discuss these things respectfully, to try to understand each other's positions, because what we may assume the other person means may not be the case, and because we might learn something in the process. And if we continue to disagree, we need to be able to disagree as the loyal opposition to one another, because that's what makes us better, and that's what makes our community better. And then we need to be able to put our argument over there and continue to coexist in community with one another over here. When I was a very green and rather judgmental rabbinical student, I remember coming home from my first year of study in Israel and complaining to my rabbi, Rabbi Michael Dolgan, that the other rabbinical students were so ignorant. They didn't even know anything about the world. Most of them had just gotten a passport so that they could attend the first year of study in Israel. They hardly knew any Hebrew. They just cared about singing songs and writing poetry and not studying texts and learning Tanakh and Talmud and Halakha. How are these people going to be rabbis? I lamented. How could I possibly respect them as colleagues? My rabbi patiently explained to me that there needs to be all kinds of rabbis because there are all kinds of Jews. There needs to be multiple ways of meeting people's needs and appealing to their sensibilities. Leadership comes in many different forms, and he encouraged me not to be so closed-minded about what makes a leader and a rabbi. Just like the Havdalah candle, he said, it's only Havdalah candle if it has multiple wicks. They're braided together, and when they are lit, those multiple wicks create a flame that's bigger and brighter than each individual wick would have been alone. So too with community. We burn brighter when multiple wicks come together. In their wisdom, the rabbis remind us of the need for differing opinions and of sometimes bending to meet in the middle. Back in the 11th century, a French rabbi called Rashi opined that when you put up your mezuzah, it should be hung vertically. But then Rashi's grandson came along. He was known as Rabbeinu Tam. Though he was raised by Rashi and Rashi's daughter, his mother, who had the tradition of hanging it vertically, he decided that the mezuzah should be affixed horizontally, giving the reason that the 10 Commandments in the Torah scrolls were kept horizontally in the Ark in the temple. Seemingly an impasse. 150 years later, Rabbi Jacob ben Asher, also known as the Tur, was writing his book of Jewish law, the Arba'a Turim. In it, Ben Asher suggests that the way to hold by the precedents of both Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam was to split the difference and affix the mezuzah at a slant. And that is what we do to this day. Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam also disagreed about how tefillin were to be assembled. And you know something? Despite their disagreement on something so basic and fundamental as how to hang a mezuzah or how to arrange the scrolls inside those tiny little boxes of tefillin, I bet Rashi and his grandson still had Shabbos together. Just like those Torah scholars whose argument counted as a separate person also shared a meal. Despite holding differing opinions, they still came together in friendship and peace. This compromise is the definition of shalom bayit, peace in the house. And we're reminded of it every time we walk into our house, whether our homes where we live or our Jewish communal home where we pray and learn. We see the mezuzah, and we ought to remember the need to bend, to incline our ears closer to another person, to listen to what they have to say, to find a middle ground, and to recognize that just because we may have different opinions, it doesn't mean that we have to vilify one another. We can put the argument over there, where it belongs, and still sit down and have Shabbos together. Kei Yehi Ratzon. May it be God's will.